Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Roger Wilkinson. I'm the TASA Digital Publications Editor, and I'd like to welcome you today to this presentation by Grazyna Zajdow and Kerry Power, entitled The Trials and Tribulations Around the Ethics of Social Media Research. Before I pass it over to them, I'd like to just acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And today I'm coming to you from North Queensland in Gimoi, Wallumborough, Yidinji country. And you're quite welcome as well if you wish to tell us where you're from. So thank you. And first of all, it will be Grazyna Zajdow from Deakin University talking. Thank you.
Thanks, Roger. Hello, everyone. I'm speaking to you from Melbourne, from Wurundjeri country. And I think, and I'm never sure about what my position is anymore, because I'm almost finished with my full-time academic life. I'm going on leave and then I'm retiring this year. But prior to that, for a number of years, I was chair of the Faculty Ethics Committee, which at our university, at Deakin University, looked after the so-called low risk ethics applications. But I was also a member of the university ATREC, which is the Human Research Ethics Committee, which oversees essentially all ethics applications, including low risk, though each individual faculty was charged with looking after low risk. That's the way it's structured in my university. Other universities have slightly different structures. A lot of universities have only a single committee overseeing all human research, but I'm not sure how your institutions look at it. I thought that what I would do is outline some of the issues as ethics committees that we have in terms of human research and social media research. And again, my institution doesn't just rely on, but it is structured so that all our decisions have to be in line with the National Statement on Human Research Ethics. So these aren't just guidelines, these are the legal requirements that we have to follow. And what happened when the National Statement updated in 2018 took up really most of our hours of deliberation for quite a long time before finally the decisions were embedded. So if everybody is happy with that, I will share my screen. I've got a few PowerPoints. So we're sharing the screen, and if I can find my PowerPoints, I will be very happy. Where's PowerPoints? Here we are. Thank you very much. Share. Okay. I'll go through it from top to bottom. All right. So these are some of my reflections from the university ethics space, with the proviso that individual universities have slightly different interpretations and structures that people deal with. But I think what's really interesting is how we understand the logic of the ethics space from university committees. And it is a logic, and our problems really do stem from that logic if they are problems. So we are bound by the National Statement on Ethical Conduct in Human Research, plus a few other statements, but this is the one that I'd like to concentrate on today. It was updated in 2018, and there were a number of very specific additions to the 2018 update that really made a difference to the way that we understood the space altogether. We have to understand the national statement comes from the NHMRC. So it is really very much a health and biological and scientifically oriented view of the human being and human research. So it has always been, if you like, problematic for the social sciences. It's not to say that we don't want to be ethical, but when the structures on which we rely are effectively based on a particular view of the human world, not necessarily as a social being, that changes, or that presents us major problems. So I thought I'd go through it. And there are a number, back we go. There are a number of sections that I wanted to really look at around notions of consent, waivers of consent, the secondary use of data, which is the social media data that we're talking about, and what waivers of consent are. And I know this could be really tedious. I'm sorry, I don't want to make it tedious, but it's the only way of understanding why it is that ethics committees make the decisions that they do, and the problematic nature of so many of those decisions for us as researchers. So this is section 2.2 around consent, and 2.3 around the waiver of consent. The guiding principle for researchers is that a person's decision to participate in research is to be voluntary and based on sufficient information, adequate understanding, and my dog's barking, of both the proposed research and the implications of participation in it. Participation is voluntary. The information must be presented in ways suitable to each participant. And we need to be able to communicate this information effectively. And there is a possibility of a waiver of consent. And the waiver of consent is around large health and scientific-based databases, which doesn't always help us in terms of the social sciences. But when we talk about the secondary use of data around social media, then many of my researchers would often try and get a waiver of consent. The problem with waivers of consent is you can only give a waiver if the research is considered low risk. That is, that there is nothing more than a possibility of discomfort that comes out of the research. That being the case, waivers are often difficult to get in areas such as, a lot of areas around social research that may be interested in finding out about how our lives are, and that will have real implications about whether this would be considered low risk or not. So you can see, I don't know whether you can read it particularly well, but much of this is around, in terms of the waiver, that there can only be waivers if there's sufficient protection of privacy, confidentiality of data, the possibility of commercial exploitations of the data are not theirs, for example. And these are things that clearly show us how this is all based around databases that are made up of people's tissue samples, for example, from hospitals, not necessarily social media. But when we talk about a waiver of consent for secondary data around social media, these things still are considered. I hope I'm not speaking too quickly. The important thing here is the element for the secondary use of data. And that is what Kerry will be talking about in much greater detail, with much greater knowledge about that than I. And the update to the statements made very specific reference to the secondary use of data, which didn't exist before. Once that was put very specifically in the update, then each HREC needed to take account of this. Whereas beforehand, before 2018, because they didn't discuss the secondary use of data, we could pretend that we really didn't need to get consent from people on Twitter or Facebook. Now we specifically have to understand the nature of this area. And they said that they wrote that research may involve access to and use of data or information that was originally generated or collected for previous research or for non-research purposes. That's where we really fell over. The moment that that was included, we really fell over, because remember, whatever the data is, once you are using a person where one day they could have been your friend, but the next day they become part of your research, they move, your relationship to them moves. It's no longer a friendship relationship, it is now a research relationship, and you have quite distinct responsibilities that you may not have had in the past, including routinely collected data or information. So if we think about secondary use of data and ethical obligations, it was clear, there were some things that were quite clear, though actually, interestingly enough, at first, I come from a university that is really rule bound. We are, because we've always been an off-campus provider, and there have been in the past particular cases against the university because students who were off-campus students claimed that they didn't get the same attention as on-campus students did, or on-campus students complained if we made their attendance at tutorials compulsory when off-campus students didn't. We are really rule bound. We had to make rules about that. The issue around fairness, goes right through our university. And so we have rules for all of this. And at first, it was not clear whether Hansard court transcripts, Royal Commission reports could be treated as data that was in the public domain, interestingly enough. Because, for example, in some royal commissions, there were, like the Royal Commission on child sexual abuse, there was a lot of information there that was really, very, very detailed and certainly not low risk. Media reports and news articles, how do we deal with them? But eventually the lawyers, we had to get the university solicitors involved to give us a clear idea. The lawyer said, actually, all of these sorts of things are public facing. So Hansard court transcripts, Royal Commission reports, media reports, news articles, public archives, where people have provided consent as long as it wasn't health related, right? This at first suggested to us that, we're open, we can use all of this. But then the issue of secondary data at that area, as Kerry wonderfully points out in her article, that, liminal space, what is private and what is public? And that is always an issue for us, even now, I have to say, it is always an issue for us. And the logic of this is that the researcher has to show very clearly that if there has to be a reason why they cannot get specific consent from every single person whose data will be used in research. And if you can't get specific consent, how can you argue, under what conditions do you argue that consent can be implied or can be ignored because it's part of a database where consent isn't necessary? That's all I wanted to talk about here. For me, what was important as chair is trying to explain, particularly to students and supervisors who were not, who had never really dealt with our committees before, because of course they are really, really hard to deal with, that they have to make a very specific argument. If you want to use secondary data, where does it come from? Why can't you get specific consent from the people that you're going to be asking? If you want a waiver of consent, how you can only get the waiver if it's low risk. And low risk, it's a very low bar for low risk, or rather it's a high bar for low risk. That if there is the possibility of anything more than discomfort coming out of the research, then you have to quite specifically get consent from those people. I want to leave it there because I'm happy to answer questions. Roger, I don't know how you want me to do it, whether now or at the end.
Right, so mine's sort of like a personal kind of presentation, I suppose, about, you know, how I did my research on Twitter. So I sort of thought that I would really focus on my process in case anyone's thinking of doing it, and you know, what was going through my head at the time. So I focused on things that occurred to me throughout the process, which was obviously a long one because it was my PhD. The ethical ambivalence that I came across, research presence, online identities, privacy, the ethical online researcher, so thinking that that's definitely a possibility, ethics in my process, online research consent, how to get it, and drawing on the theory, well, Barad in particular, on diffraction, sort of to help me work through the things that I was noticing. I'm not really sure if I'll spend much time on Barad because she deserves much more time. So dwelling in online forums obviously is different than meeting someone face to face. And Driscoll and Gregg offer a question of ethical relevance to any researcher who performs ethnographic research in online community blogging sites. You know, are you a member or are you a participant observer? And when examining groups or individuals in research, one can observe, quote, describe, analyze data, but what does it say? What does a participant have when their presence is presented in research? And what contextual concerns should we employ? So Lynn suggests that online identities involved a more complicated process of potential risks than those of people holding offline identities. However, while I agree online participation in research has a narrow history, well, it's getting better. Obviously, when I was writing this and beginning my research was around 2014. I have to say too that there weren't that many art teachers from Australia on Twitter then. It's really changed now, but it was mainly UK and US participants. However, while I agree that there's further clarification in safety and ethics, I do argue that there's a dearth of humans that have offline identities only. So further to this participant agency needs to be addressed. That's what I tend to really focus on in this presentation. So many researchers using virtual ethnographic practices postulate boundaries. There's many and ongoing research in this area. The literature surrounding virtual ethnographic research suggests there's an ethical ambivalence. So Hein highlights ethical issues that can plague studies, and she refers to the issue of developing an effective ethnographic presence and the role of informed consent. So for example, binaries such as public and private data temper at the nerve of what might be risky in online research. And the interactions of users of any social networking site might be deeply intimate and experienced as if they were private. While we seem to know this, we tend to forget it. Although the use of public Twitter accounts implies that anyone from the public can view information, and it may not be the intention of the Twitter user that anyone reads this information, but the user with whom they are interacting, let alone used for research purposes. So, however, when users agree to participate on Twitter, data may be taken into unknown territory regarding what information's accessed. And we really, remember I was writing this before there was that huge kerfuffle about the Facebook data breach. So people were speculating that there was issues here. So the research presence. So when do ethnographics appear in online data collection processes? And this is an historical sort of question regarding ethnography practices, but the lines may blur more purposefully when you're online. So time zones, geographical boundaries are loosened, and when embedded in an online community, it can be as covert or as obvious as the researcher deems fit. However, when ethnographers connect with online communities to conduct research, boundaries between what is considered intimate and what is acknowledged as in the public domain can alter and confuse depending on the position of both the researcher and the research. And, you know, I'm really just speaking to qualitative studies here, let alone the quantitative mining that occurs. So online identities, you know, a shift or identity play may not disturb what researchers would describe in the field regarding identity, but rather, according to Hine, this is not necessarily something to dwell on. However, I argue a contrary view. When identities shift intentionally or unintentionally regarding the purpose, including anonymity, play, or any other variant, the complexity of identity and ethics in online research needs, you know, to be further addressed. And there may be ambivalence or confusion concerning the welfare of human interactions, including the menace of exploitive research practices, you know, particularly obviously in target advertising, the way that algorithms are designed to target particular groups. And we definitely know this in terms of political targeting as well. Can we say that that using so-called unidentified data does not expose the identity of the research subject regarding name or signifier is an acceptable research practice? So privacy, small identifies issues revolving around ambiguous and evolving understanding of privacy in network communication, as coming from all stakeholders in the pool of internet communication, which includes users and researchers who mine data. And they specifically address Twitter data to identify key complex problems that surround the use and reuse of virtual data. So when discussing the issue of privacy, Small examine the issues of ownership, authenticity, and reliability. And with this in mind, the goal of their paper was to discuss appropriate guides to address issues of ethics when mining cyber data, and in particular, archiving such material. I don't know why I'm getting tongue-tied with that. So I don't know if you know that the Library of Congress in the United States literally were archiving all public tweets to a point, but now they've changed their mind and they're archiving particular tweets, which is not really that clarified. So this is interesting. I wonder if people knew that what they were putting out on a program such as Twitter was being archived in a library. So ethical online researchers. So Whiteman points towards the ethical internet researcher in her exploration of unsettling and of expectations and assumptions that are both felt both by researchers and internet users when working in online environments. The position that researchers have generally relied on when applying for ethical clearance, and which is just that clearance that proposes that any foreseeable harm is avoided by ensuring guidelines are met to ensure the safety of participants. Traditional research proposes certain familiar arguments that ensure the researcher and the research are nestled in reachable agreements, and due process can take care of the rest. However, the researchable world that Whiteman proposes has altered, and not regarding what is expected of researchers, but by the known challenges that a faceless online data pool can enable. And this faceless internet crowd is who I am addressing when considering messy online research ethics. And so when conceptualizing knowledge gained from tapping into an internet data pool, one may question many things, which can include the role of the researcher, the researched, privacy and ethics, intention, authenticity, the vastness of scope, regarding power relations, the researcher, regardless of research intention, including ethical positions, must acknowledge there are billions of nuances affecting online user participation. An interesting point that Grazyna made before was that, you know, one day someone can be your friend and the next day they can be part of your research. And also sometimes there's which implies that there's a conflict there. And ethical boundaries surrounding available data deemed public in a program like Twitter, for example, are not easily wrapped in a terms of service agreement. So my ethics and research process was to really study the interactions of art educators, potential participants' data, how it could be used. I stared at I think my internet connection's unstable, so just let me know if I come out of sound for there. I stared at my computer screen, obviously, wondering how to make decisions regarding informed consent and privacy. And these decisions fall initially under the banner of research ethics, but who was I to know what was ethical regarding and using online information? So I read the Twitter terms of service and received advice from my university ethics department. So applying for approval, what was required in my university was that the business or whoever was where the research was happening approved of my process. So I had to think, well, how am I going to get approval from Twitter? You know, there was so many online forums and people begging to research on Twitter, and there was mixed messages and all sorts of things. And I really had to think about this. So I decided to email their business department. And just here's my sort of an example of my email. My name is Kerry Power. I'm a PhD education student at my university, attempting to research online interactions of art. And I was explained why I was using their data, and that I was going to display. The main thing with the rules with Twitter is that you display the tweets correctly, which requires specific positioning of the bird and how you'll notice that when you see tweets quoted in articles that the bird is presented on the right-hand side, there's particular terms that cover that. And I was really lucky to get a reply. I actually got a reply from Sophie Herscher, who said that if as long as no one was surprised about the use of their content, I could proceed. And that was enough for my ethics approval in my university. I just thought, ripper, how do I do this? Okay, so it really, how did I manage to get approval from my prospective participants? So I decided to start a Twitter account just about research and explaining exactly what I was doing. So I said, I'm a PhD student researching art teachers. Following this account implies consent to participate. You need to be 18 years and over, unfollowed to opt out. And I created a timeline as well. It was actually 6 months. But I needed to direct them because I needed their consent. So I couldn't get this on Twitter. So I needed to create a website and have my my explanatory statement rather there for them to read and consent to. This was a long time in thinking through how this was going to play out. I'm wondering whether it might be easier now, but but back then it just seemed really, you know, it took a while, a lot of brain power. So I directed my participants to the statement and mentioned that it was low level, you know, that any distress, they could contact the ethics department at my university. And I provided a brief description of my study. But the things that I began really finding interesting about this process that I've been alluding to up to now is that what was regarded as low level risk, and how is that just sort of conceptualized? And I was sort of deciding to kind of challenge these assumptions and you know, bringing in sort of the theoretical position that my thesis was drawing on, which was Karen Barrad's theory of diffraction, and applying it to these sorts of conundrums, if you like. And I found it really interesting. Drawing on Barrad, she defines diffraction as a physical phenomena that lies at the centre of some key discussions in physics and the philosophy of physics. And what's significant about Barrad's definition is that it's not just analogous regarding physical phenomena, but it's also a methodological approach that enables a point of reference and continuity about how to think about matter, difference, entanglements. And, you know, by this stage, I really was seeing Twitter as this incredible, massive entanglement of ideas, problems, you know, a whole lot of things. And, you know what, I'm stating the obvious, I know, because we've seen what Twitter has done, you know, up into, you know, to the present day. But remember, I'm starting in 2014. So their inputs, such as tweets, have already merged and transformed into other tweets, other devices in the minds and algorithms that support them. And although this is not a desperate view of ethical concerns afforded in virtual research, it's an acknowledgement of entanglements. And this acknowledgement brings dialogue to the complexity of ethical positions in online research. And diffractive positions do not waive accountability, but rather than trouble it. So this was my sort of jumping point for why this was significant in my research. And I'm not going to be able to have time to go into depth with Karen Barrad, and maybe some people are relieved, I'm not sure. But the reason why I found this interesting is that we're sort of what we were entering into in terms of our perception and what was going on in online research was different, and we really needed to acknowledge that. And so that is the beginning, I guess, of the conversation about my research on Twitter.
Okay, thank you both, Kerry and Grazyna. And I notice in the chat line, Kieran asks you a question, and maybe Kieran, you might like to come on and just elaborate a little bit more, but basically, how was your response rate? Kieran, would you like?
Yes, okay, great.
Yeah.
All right, so as you can imagine, if you're an art teacher on Twitter in 2014, you are probably not that keen on having your tweets read and used for research. So the participation was quite low, but incredible amounts of data from studying those interactions over 6 months. Did I answer your question?
Roger, can I just add something? Because there are a couple of things that you said, Kerry, that were really interesting that have changed substantially since you did that research. For example, for a long time, my university would not accept the Twitter terms of use as acceptable ethical ways of using that data, until the legal part, the solicitors, the university solicitors, decided that since Twitter is a public forum, that therefore what people add to that, or how people use it, is in the same public area as if they had answered journalists' questions that ended up in a piece of media, so that you wouldn't need, these days, for the most part, unless you're looking at young people under 18 or particular disadvantaged groups, you wouldn't need ethical approval for using Twitter anymore. They've accepted that it is public in that sense. It was interesting. I just wanted to say how it's really, really evolving and changing.
But also, isn't it interesting that you bring that up, Grazyna? Because I would still argue that it's necessary in research to gain informed consent, regardless of that waiver that they're suggesting.
Yeah, and in that sense, it's not a waiver. You just don't need to apply for ethical approval at all. Yeah. Just as if you're using archives or court transcripts. But was it Ricky was saying about getting trolls' approval? You could argue that you don't need them anymore. You can just use it because it's a public space. However, I'd always go, to your ethics committee or ethics advisor to make sure that that's how your university actually uses it.
Yeah, I not only needed informed consent, but I needed approval from Twitter to be able to do this. So yeah, I thought that was an interesting thing that I needed to conquer.
Well, it's considered their intellectual property. I mean, I don't know whether people realize that anything that you upload, say, onto Twitter or Facebook or any of those things, including your own photos, are their intellectual property. They're no longer your own intellectual property, including your tweets.
Absolutely.
Now,
Ricky's got a raised hand.
Sorry, Ricky had a question, made a comment about trolls. Would you like to elaborate a little bit, Ricky?
Oh, thank you so much for allowing me to speak. Just that I'm really interested in this space because I'm doing a lot of work in trying to understand the perception of why people have such a problem with different ways of gender expression, especially being trans and in schools, which I'm really interested to find out, like what is the motivation for people. And it's interesting to me that when I'm looking or tweeting about things, the troll seems to appear, and it's always seems to be a certain characteristics of it. And then I was just fascinated, Kerry, with your work because just to add on to that, one thing that fascinated me with your work too, Kerry, is that do you find that Beth teaches there is this sort of like almost a taboo that if you have Twitter, you have to kind of be very mindful of what you put out there because it might contravene whatever the school policy. And I had a lot of— Oh
gosh, you've raised so many fantastic issues, Ricky.
Yeah, and I had a problem when I was teaching because of my situation being trans. They made me sign things that I would not disclose, I would not promote. It's what they called lifestyles for their students. And I was wondering, with your research, did you find that, I guess, one of the issues you had to deal with the bias or the unconscious or conscious bias censoring of self in that space when they were giving?
Oh boy, it was most definitely conscious, Ricky, and I'm really pleased that you've brought it up because I think we're all petrified about what we say on social media when we're being our educators themselves, I suppose. So you'll see a lot of disclaimers on some bios that excuse views expressed are my own. So yes, most definitely teachers are very cautious about what they say online. And it's really interesting, Ricky, too, because I've continued to connect with teachers, everywhere on Twitter, and I'm really interested that some of the things that they do put online, I wonder, gee, are you sure that you want to put that out there as well? There's so much murkiness to the way that we project ourselves, but also, as you say, that professionalism, Ricky, that we're worried that we need to censor ourselves. And so what does that really say about what we are putting online as well? And what versions of our opinions are we doing? So much to write about. Fantastic point.
Also, I notice in the comments, Rachel is making some comments about Whitney Phillips' work. Rachel, would you like to add to that, or would you prefer to remain anonymous there?
It's all right. I'll jump on. Hi, everyone. Thanks for some really interesting conversations. It's always nice to hear too about like personal experiences with like how you kind of navigate all of these issues. I was just recommending Whitney Phillips's work. She's done some awesome work on trolling communities, and I think a lot of the issues that have been touched on today in terms of how you engage potentially harmful communities when you are looking for informed consent, and what it means to take care of yourself as a researcher when you're entering into these toxic spaces as well. So that was just a reading recommendation for everyone or anyone who's interested.
Fantastic, Rachel. I'm actually writing down her name now, and I agree. You can probably imagine with the research that I was doing, it was probably unlikely that people participating were going to show any troll-like behaviour. But because I was very much, just dealing with educators, really. But if you think about what your what you're bringing up, Rachel, is that there's also obviously lots of other work that can be done that would involve that aspect. And so, yeah, I'm just writing down that name for sure. Thank you.
Okay, thanks both Rachel and Kerry. And David Rowe has his hand up. So, David.
Thanks for that. I'll take my hand down if I suppose I should. Thanks. Really interesting stuff. And I mean, I kept wanting to jump in about all kinds of things, including my contestation and conflict sometimes with the research committees over the years, sometimes rather jaundiced views of the people who make their careers on research, on ethics committees. Sometimes people who don't do research, trying to prevent people who do research from doing it. He says, having had a few clashes over the years, I've got a kind of real curveball question, but I think it really gets to this idea of the public and the private. I mean, a lot of my own research has been in the so-called legacy or mainstream media. So, I mean, the major questions there were, again, ones of intellectual property, but you could get around it with fair dealing provisions and comment and review, that kind of thing. But there's this fascinating trend, and I think it originated in France. I'm sure some of you have heard of it, of the right to be forgotten, which actually introduces a temporal notion to social media, which is that it is now possible in some legal jurisdictions to go to a government and say that what I said in public and the information that is available in public about me on a social media platform, I no longer want to be public, and I want to be taken down so that I can be allowed to disappear. And I mean, I think for researchers, this is kind of really, really fascinating idea that it's not only a question of what is public and what is private, but what was once public can be privatized to a degree by the person who exercises their right to be forgotten in some jurisdictions. So I just wondered if you've got any kind of comment about that process, maybe, you know, what that might reveal about this really difficult area we have of determining the public and the private.
Got lots of thoughts. What about you, Graz? Yeah, maybe you've got some thoughts.
A couple of things. One of them is because we've entered into the world of social media rather than what preceded it. Basically, you know, we knew that really only people with power to a large extent were public facing in the past. So effectively they never disappeared. But now what we have are a lot of people who, you know, who are out there in the public on social media, who wouldn't consider themselves public people, you know, people in as in celebrities or politicians or whatever, and they actually see themselves as private, and they see what they've posted online as private, and having the right to actually keep that private, even though, you know, theoretically, you know, practically, I'm not sure how you do deal with that. You know, it is problematic in a way. And the reality is it's a matter of people in their lifetimes, because there is no privacy after you are dead. And this we know, you know, that what's left of you after you're dead is available for anybody to do anything with, which is fair enough. I don't have an issue with that particularly. But the issue is around what we intend, what our intentions are when we are on there, and that's problematic.
Right. I also think, David, when you were speaking, I really thought about how people try and scrub themselves off Google, how you actually hire companies to do that for you. I thought about how images have got out online that for people's privacy, to try and, particularly when they're hurting that person, that they need to get those images taken offline. You've opened a Pandora's box there, but what an interesting one. And I don't have any answers, but I'm that when you do put your information out there, I don't know if you can completely wipe it. And there are purposeful kind of things in place to make sure that doesn't happen, including ownership.
Yeah, just very quickly, I think, I mean, the legal requirement, if you get a ruling in your favor in this case, is that the state can require your, you know, Twitter, Facebook, etc., to take down information concerning you. Now, this can be sort of quite serious, really, because I mean, it's often used by people who've committed, say, juvenile offences, and they've been in, you know, and so on, and they want that removed. But let's say it's someone who's, you know, who's been convicted of, say, sexual assault in the past, you know, who might be regarded as predatory, who might then seek to have that scrubbed from, you know, as much as possible from the public sphere. Anyway, thank you. It's a fascinating area.
Can I?
Good question.
Can I refer to Eve's question about elaborating on social media with young people under 18? Ethically speaking, if there is a real possibility of somebody under 18, then you actually have to think about how you get their consent. You actually can't. You need to get their consent and their parental consent as well. So that makes it makes it very difficult. It makes it an exceedingly difficult way of negotiating. That's the reality of it. If we're saying that there are certain groups of people who are vulnerable and could be easily exploited by both researchers and others, then we have to make sure that as researchers we position ourselves as being as protective of those people as possible, in which case it's a difficulty if you're using a site that's likely to have lots of people under 18. If their age is sort of incidental and you don't know what their age is, perhaps the argument could be that, you know, you won't need to worry about it too much. But if you are going on a site where it's clear the vast bulk of people who use it are under 18, then you are in an ethical minefield, really. That's just the way that it is.
Oh yeah, you know, think about the chats in gaming, and now that people are trying to mine as well. Yeah,
yeah,
it's a really great question.
Yeah, for sure.
Thanks, David, and thanks for the responses from both Kerry and Grazyna. Sharon has made a comment in the about whether we need to treat different social media differently. So Sharon's going to talk to that now.
Oh, thank you. Look, I'm probably coming back to more pragmatic considerations at this point than the really interesting, I guess, philosophical implications. I happen to supervise a lot of social work students, and a lot of them are international, so they're often wanting to do their research projects based on conditions in their home countries. Now, mostly we've pointed them to published media, but some of them have been looking on social media. And I've got this very specific question around Facebook, because it seems to me like part of what Kerry was talking about related very specifically to Twitter and the terms of use of Twitter. In this case, I was looking at Facebook, and, you know, I guess the convention that, you know, with Facebook, you can't use any data from a group you have to join without getting ethics approval is fairly well established. But we've sort of always used the guideline for our students that if it's an open group that I could simply log on and see, that is regarded as sort of public domain. But what it's sounding like is that's potentially not public domain, or that we would have to seek the advice of Twitter. And, you know, the specific example I've given, which is quite complex, is looking at mental health information on public websites it's written in Nepali, so I'm relying on my students' translation, and they were literally counting the likes on different pieces of information provided to try and get an indication of the kind of information people were seeking. And they commented that their original research design had been that they wanted to use the comments, and there simply were very few because they said the stigma is still fairly strong. So in this case, we said they didn't need an ethics approval because of the public domain, but it's sounding like we would have needed a step of going to Facebook about the Nepali website, but also this question of risk comes into it now. So I guess I'm
interested, Sharon, how could they be displaying that data in their research? Would they be identifying the...
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. What we did is identify the websites themselves that they were collecting the data from, and then it was literally quantified in terms of likes. So there was no sort of tracing back to individuals, but obviously if you looked at the website and then looked at the broad areas, so they were dividing it into different kinds of mental health issues that they were particularly looking at. Was this mostly relating to anxiety or depression or other specifics, and then we produced quantifiable charts.
Can I say that Facebook actually has different conditions than Twitter, so they have to be seen separately. You know, from the perspective, if this came to me in the ethics committee, I'd say using the comments would be, unless you had explicit approval from the people who comment, would be not allowed, but likes and various other emojis would have been acceptable because they're totally anonymous. It's the anonymity and privacy that becomes important under those circumstances. But Twitter, yeah, you have to look at the conditions and the rules of conditions of service for each individual platform to work out. Yes.
No, thank you for that, because I've got other students that have used comments under YouTube for their analysis,
Well,
which sounds another.
I mean, from our perspective at the time that I was on the committee, it's been almost a year since I've been off it, but I still do reviews for it, and certainly issues around using of comments would be seen differently to what's available from the website itself as news out there.
Okay.
Yeah, because those comments can be traceable.
Yeah.
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 No, thank you for that, because I know our ethics committee to date has taken the view that social media is a public platform. So,
but there have been instances where comments have been traced, people have been identified, and if there's a possibility of them being identified, then really we've overstepped that ethical boundary. And I mean, it's problematic. It really is problematic for all of us. That if we say, for example, that we need to tread very carefully for around children and in Indigenous people and various other groups of people, then we need to think ethically around all sorts of groups of people. It is a difficulty. And of course, the longer that we work, the more we realize that universities now do not respect our capabilities, our abilities as researchers to make those sorts of decisions for ourselves. Universities don't trust our moral compasses, and I have to say sociologists in the past have done a really good job of making the argument that you can't trust academics because they're all ruling class males, so therefore we have to rein them in. So we're always caught in a bind there.
I'm interested in your reaction to that advice, Sharon, because what are those implications for your students?
It's actually really problematic because we've tended to steer them away from primary research, largely for pragmatic reasons to do with ethics, even though we know they're going to do it in the field. So I guess one of our first issues is that we sometimes feel we send out social workers who are inexperienced in doing primary research because we've not been able to support them doing it in their studies, and then they'll head straight into workplaces where they're asked to do primary research without necessarily having the same robust considerations around them. So I actually sort of feel we have a duty of care that we fail them in that regard, and their future clients. In terms of the restrictions, it's enormously difficult to support students studying difficult social issues, and social workers are constantly in that space. And so these are mostly around mental health studies. This is a very common area that our students want to look at. And so we've had some really amazing research produced, but now that now based on this, I would have to question how much could be even publicly reported, at a conference in terms of insights into how people there's no such thing as an unmediated forum in social media because people are, performative, but it is a relatively unfiltered forum. So I think we're going to have to find some creative ways to be able to engage with that material, because I do regard it as incredibly important source material for us. So I'd say that's where I'm sort of left. Are we at the point of saying, well, I think maybe statements like you used for Twitter that we put up, if we want to use comments in a certain section saying, I would like to use comments, in this, whether that would possibly get us through it, or whether we have to actually set up our own forums, that are fully disclosed from the start. I'm not quite sure at this point.
Okay, now I noticed in the comments that Kelly's made a reference to something. And Kelly, would you like to talk about it very quickly if you've got the time?
If my microphone works, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Just very briefly, I'm doing my PhD on Facebook using Facebook groups. So I've done some trawling through all of the policies and procedures in Facebook and found this interesting thing because Facebook's doing a lot of changes at the moment with their metaverse stuff. And they had a Facebook or Meta communities thing in November last year where they changed a whole lot of stuff based on their groups. So when you were talking about the public groups versus private groups and those sorts of things, there's 3 levels of groups now in Facebook: public, private, public and private, and then private hidden and private not hidden. So there's, depending where they sit in Facebook, depends on the level of what you can and can't use in the public and private space, I guess. But when I was trawling through all of their new stuff, I found this researcher APIs stuff, which has come out of their Cambridge Analytica debacle. And they're trying to fix all of those issues. So it's not available in Australia yet, but it's certainly a space to watch as they open up that. It's available for people in the US and the UK at the moment for researchers on Facebook to register with Facebook. And that's something that hopefully will be made available to us in Australia soon. Space to watch, because I think that, you know, the metaverse is becoming bigger and broader as it expands.
Most definitely.
Okay.
It sounds interesting, Kelly.
Yeah, well,
Thanks,
and the metaverse
Kelly.
is more than just Facebook too. So
Thanks, Kelly. I'll try and remember to include that link in the YouTube video that we put up later today or tomorrow morning.
yeah, there's a lot of interesting changes on Facebook at the moment, and I think, you know, they want us there, but they don't want us there. So it'll be interesting.
And then when we think about, you know, what will our position be if we are officially part of those, you know, that Facebook world or the metaverse world?
Yeah,
How can we present ourselves as critical sociologists then?
their official policy is it's fine so long as you're not using bots.
Right. Yeah.
So
Kerry, do you have any last quick comments?
Just been fascinated to hear listen to the questions and definitely very informative, Grazia, to listen to your expertise on it being part of the ethics team at Deakin too. Just really pleased to be here and really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, on behalf of TASA, I'd like to thank everybody, including Grazyna and Kerry,